The millionaire widow's baby wouldn't stop crying in the restaurant. Until the waitress did the unthinkable, the millionaire froze. Share where you're watching from in the comments. Thanks for your support. Get ready for a story with an unexpected surprise waiting for you. The soft clink of fine china and the gentle murmur of conversation filled Marco's ears as he sat in the corner booth of Ristorante Bella Vista, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. At 34 years old, Marco Castellano had built an empire from nothing. Tech startups, real estate investments, and ventures that had made him a billionaire before he turned 30. He had everything: wealth beyond measure, a penthouse overlooking the skyline, a collection of luxury cars, and a reputation as one of the most eligible bachelors in Manhattan. But tonight, none of it mattered. His 2-year-old son, Leonardo, was inconsolable. The little boy sat in the high chair beside Marco, his face turning crimson as his cries grew louder and more desperate. Marco's hands trembled slightly as he tried everything he could think of, offering toys, appealing to his son's favorite foods, holding him, rocking him gently. Nothing worked. People were beginning to stare. A woman at the next table gave him a sympathetic look, while others whispered behind their menus. Leonardo's mother, Marco's late wife Isabella, had passed away 18 months ago from a sudden illness. Marco had been devastated, not just by the loss of his beloved wife, but by the responsibility that came with raising a toddler alone. He had nannies, housekeepers, and staff, but there was something about the comfort of a mother that no amount of money could buy. Tonight, he felt that absence more acutely than ever. "I'm sorry," Marco whispered to his son, his voice cracking slightly. He caught the eye of the restaurant manager, who was hovering nearby with a concerned expression. Marco had reserved the entire section, as he often did, to avoid disruptions. But nothing could stop a hungry, overtired toddler. "We'll leave soon. I apologize for the disturbance." The manager nodded understandingly, but Marco could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He was a man who could negotiate billion-dollar deals, who could command rooms full of powerful people. But right now, he felt utterly helpless. He gently bounced Leonardo, singing softly, but the child's cries only intensified. That was when she appeared. She moved through the restaurant with the grace of someone who had worked there for years, carrying plates and glasses with practiced ease. She was stunning, tall and lithe, with warm brown eyes and an air of quiet confidence that drew Marco's attention immediately. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore the crisp white blouse and black trousers uniform of the restaurant staff. Her name tag read, Sophie. Sophie had just finished serving a table across the room when she noticed the distressed child and the equally distressed man trying desperately to soothe him. She paused, tilting her head slightly as if listening to Leonardo's cries, understanding something that others might have missed. Without hesitation, she changed direction and approached Marco's table. "May I?" Sophie asked softly, her voice warm and gentle. Marco looked up at her, confusion registering on his face. What?" Sophie didn't wait for a full response. She gently took Leonardo from his high chair, cradling him against her chest with the ease of someone accustomed to holding small children. The boy's cries didn't stop immediately, but they lessened in intensity. Sophie swayed slightly, humming a soft lullaby, her eyes closed as if she were lost in the moment. "Sometimes babies just need comfort," Sophie said quietly, not making eye contact with Marco, but focusing entirely on Leonardo. "There's nothing wrong. They just need to feel safe." Marco watched, transfixed, as this stranger, this woman he'd never seen before, seemed to understand his son in a way that eluded him. Leonardo's cries gradually subsided, his little fists relaxing as he nestled against Sophie's shoulder. Within minutes, the boy had fallen silent, his breathing becoming steady and rhythmic. It was then that Marco noticed something unusual about the way Sophie was holding Leonardo, the way her body had shifted slightly. His eyes widened as he realized what was happening. Sophie had unbuttoned her blouse slightly, and she was allowing Leonardo to nurse at her breast. Not from any biological connection, but from a place of pure compassion and motherly instinct. She was doing the one thing Marco couldn't. She was providing the comfort of maternal closeness that his son desperately needed. Marco felt tears prick his eyes. He wanted to say something, to thank her, to ask her name, but he remained silent, watching as this beautiful, compassionate stranger gave his son something no nanny or toy or amount of money could provide. She didn't seem embarrassed or uncomfortable. Her eyes remained closed, her expression serene, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. The restaurant had gone quiet around them. A few diners had noticed, and while some looked away discreetly, others watched with visible emotion. No one said anything. No one dared interrupt this moment of pure human connection. After several minutes, Leonardo's eyes grew heavy. Sophie continued to hold him, cradling him as if he were her own child. When she finally looked down at him, she saw that he had fallen asleep, his breathing deep and peaceful, his tiny hand curled against her neck. "He's asleep now," Sophie whispered, carefully buttoning her blouse while keeping Leonardo cradled against her. "Would you like me to transfer him to your lap?" Marco nodded, unable to speak. As Sophie carefully placed Leonardo into his arms, their fingers brushed for just a moment. Marco felt a spark of electricity run through him. Not just attraction, though he certainly felt that, but something deeper. It was gratitude mixed with wonder, and something else he couldn't quite name. "Thank you," Marco finally managed. I don't know what I would have done." Sophie smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made her entire face light up. "He just needed his mother's comfort. I have 2 younger siblings, and I helped raise them both. I know what it's like when a little one is overwhelmed." She paused, and Marco noticed a flicker of sadness cross her face. "I'm sorry if I overstepped. I shouldn't have—" "No," Marco interrupted, his voice urgent. "Please, don't apologize. What you did was extraordinary. Most people would have just walked away. You showed my son more kindness and understanding in 5 minutes than—" He trailed off, not wanting to disparage the professional caregivers he employed. "That's what mothers do," Sophie said softly. She glanced at Leonardo, still sleeping peacefully in Marco's arms. "He'll be fine now. Babies are resilient. They just need to know they're loved and safe." She turned to walk away, and Marco felt a sudden panic wash over him. He couldn't let her leave without knowing more about her, without thanking her properly. "Wait," he called softly, mindful not to wake Leonardo. "Please, at least let me buy you dinner. As a thank you." Sophie hesitated, a conflicted expression crossing her beautiful face. "That's not necessary. I was just doing what any person would—" "Any person wouldn't," Marco said firmly. "You're extraordinary. Please." There was a long moment of silence. Then Sophie nodded slowly. "All right. After my shift ends at 10 o'clock, I could take a break. But I don't want to be any trouble." "It's no trouble at all," Marco assured her. "I'll wait." As Sophie returned to her duties, Marco looked down at his sleeping son, then back at the place where she had disappeared into the kitchen. He had no way of knowing that this single moment of kindness would change both of their lives forever. He had no idea that the beautiful, compassionate woman who had comforted his son would become the center of his world, or that her simple act of maternal compassion would unlock something in him that he thought had died along with Isabella. All he knew was that he couldn't wait for her shift to end. Sophie pulled off her apron as the last customer left the restaurant at 9:55 p.m. Her feet ached, her lower back was sore from hours of standing and carrying heavy trays, and she was exhausted in that bone-deep way that only service industry workers understood. She had been working at Ristorante Bella Vista for 3 years, ever since she'd dropped out of college to help support her family after her father had a stroke. At 27 years old, Sophie had learned to accept the life circumstances had handed her She wasn't bitter about it, though sometimes late at night when she was alone in her tiny studio apartment in Queens, she allowed herself to dream about what might have been. She could have been in medical school by now. She'd been accepted with a scholarship before everything changed. She could have been on her way to becoming a doctor, helping people heal. Instead, she was a waitress, good at her job, but acutely aware of how limited her options were. Still, she loved her family fiercely, and she wouldn't have made any different choices. Her mother was healthy now, her father was recovering well, and her 2 younger siblings were both in college, thanks in part to the money Sophie had saved and the sacrifices she'd made. What she hadn't expected was to find herself sitting across from one of the most attractive and wealthy men she'd ever seen, in a private booth at the restaurant where she worked, eating an exquisite pasta dish he'd specially requested the kitchen prepare for her. "So you grew up in New York?" Marco asked, his dark eyes genuinely interested as he listened to her speak. "Queens," Sophie confirmed, twirling her fork in her linguine. "My parents immigrated from the Dominican Republic before I was born. They worked incredibly hard to build a life here. My mother was a nurse, and my dad was a construction worker." She paused, remembering. "He had an accident on a job site when I was in my first year of college. It was serious, spinal injury. We weren't sure he'd ever work again." Marco's expression grew serious. "That must have been terrifying." "It was," Sophie admitted. "But my parents taught me and my siblings that we take care of each other. Family comes first. So I left school and came home. I got this job, and I've been here ever since." She looked up at him with a small smile. "No regrets, though. My dad's doing better now. He'll always have limitations, but he's independent, and my siblings are thriving." Marco studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense. "You gave up your future for your family." "I gave up a particular path," Sophie corrected gently. "I didn't give up my future. This job has taught me more about human nature and compassion than any classroom could have. Plus," she added with a slight laugh, "I make decent money with tips, and the people I work with are kind. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work." "What were you studying?" Marco asked. "Pre-med," Sophie said. "I wanted to be a doctor, pediatrics specifically." She smiled. "I've always loved children. There's something about caring for them, helping them feel safe and understood. It's what drew me to work with my siblings when my dad was hurt." Marco listened intently, asking follow-up questions, genuinely interested in her story. As the conversation continued, Sophie found herself opening up in ways she rarely did. She talked about her dreams, her family, her hopes for the future. And Marco, who usually kept his personal life carefully compartmentalized and didn't discuss his feelings with anyone, found himself sharing about Isabella, about the loneliness of losing her, about the guilt he felt over not being able to comfort Leonardo the way she could have. "He needed his mother tonight," Marco said quietly, staring into his wine glass. "And I couldn't give that to him. I've tried everything. The best nannies money can buy, child psychologists, everything. But nothing replaces that bond." Sophie reached across the table and gently placed her hand on his. The touch was innocent, but it carried weight. "You love him. That's what matters. And you're trying. That's what every child needs, to know that their parent is trying, that they care enough to keep trying even when it's hard." Marco looked at their hands, then up at her face. In that moment, he saw something in Sophie that he recognized. A capacity for unconditional love, a willingness to put others' needs before her own, a quiet strength that had nothing to do with wealth or power, and everything to do with character. "Leonardo's mother," he began. "Isabella. She died 1.5 years ago. Leukemia. It was fast. We had only 6 months from diagnosis to the end. Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning, like I'm failing him because I can't be both mother and father." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "You're not failing him. You're grieving and still showing up for him every single day. That's not failure. That's courage. They talked until the restaurant staff began cleaning up around them, until the manager tactfully suggested that they might want to leave. Marco walked Sophie out to the street, reluctant to let the evening end. The November night was cool and crisp, with the bustling energy of Manhattan still thrumming through the streets. "Thank you for tonight," Sophie said, pulling her thin jacket closer around herself. "For dinner, for listening, for everything." "Can I see you again?" Marco asked. "Not here, not as a customer and waitress. As people?" Sophie hesitated. She was acutely aware of the disparity between them. His wealth, his power, his status. She was a waitress from Queens whose father was still recovering from a serious injury. She didn't belong in his world. But when she looked at him, she didn't see a billionaire. She saw a grieving man who had shown her kindness and genuine interest in her thoughts and feelings. "I'd like that," she said softly. "But I should warn you, my life is very simple. I work, I help my family, I spend time with my siblings. I don't know how to navigate your world." "Then let's create our own world," Marco said. "Just us. No billionaires, no waitresses. Just two people getting to know each other." He reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering for a moment against her cheek. The gesture was tender and intimate, and Sophie felt her heart skip a beat. "All right," she whispered. "But take things slow, okay? I'm not good with complicated situations, and someone like you—" "I'm just a man," Marco interrupted softly. "A man who's very tired of being alone. A man who watched you comfort his son with more grace and compassion than he's ever witnessed. A man who wants to know you better." He pulled out his phone. "Let me get your number?" Sophie gave him her number, and they exchanged a few text messages right then and there, both of them grinning like teenagers. When Marco finally hailed a cab to take her home, he kissed her forehead gently, a gesture so tender it made her chest ache. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, Sophie watched him through the rear window, standing alone on the sidewalk in his expensive coat and designer suit. She had no way of knowing what the future held, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Her life had just fundamentally changed. Over the next 3 weeks, Marco and Sophie saw each other every time their schedules would allow. He would pick her up after her shifts at the restaurant, and they would go to quiet places, parks, bookstores, late-night diners in neighborhoods far from his usual haunts. Marco was deliberately avoiding the spotlight, protecting both Sophie and their budding relationship from the media attention that usually followed him. Sophie met Leonardo for the first time on a Saturday afternoon in Central Park. Marco had been nervous about the introduction, unsure how his son would react to this woman who had shown him such kindness that first night, though the boy wouldn't remember her. "He's so beautiful," Sophie said softly, as she and Marco pushed Leonardo's stroller along one of the park's tree-lined paths. The child was contentedly eating a small container of grapes, his eyes wide and curious as he took in the world around him. "He has his mother's eyes," Marco said. There was sadness in his voice, but also acceptance. "I'm glad he has that. Something to remember her by, even though he won't have memories of her otherwise." Sophie reached over and squeezed his hand. "He'll have you, and he'll have the knowledge that his mother was loved and that she loved him. That's what matters." As they walked, Leonardo began to fuss, his sugar high from the grapes wearing off. Without being asked, Sophie gently lifted him from his stroller and settled him on her hip. The boy immediately seemed calmer in her arms, his head resting against her shoulder. "You're natural at this," Marco observed, watching her with undisguised affection. "I love children," Sophie said simply. "There's something pure about them, something untouched by the world's cynicism and cruelty. They teach you how to be present, how to love without complications." It was moments like these that made Marco realize how deeply he was falling for her. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was undeniably beautiful. It was her capacity for genuine human connection, her ability to make everyone around her feel valued and important. But as their relationship deepened, the reality of their situation began to press down on them both. 3 weeks into their relationship, Marco took Sophie to his penthouse for the first time. She had been nervous about going there, acutely aware that this was his private space, the place where he lived his real life. As they stepped out of the private elevator, Sophie's breath caught. The penthouse was breathtaking, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline, contemporary furniture that probably cost more than her annual salary, art on the walls that she recognized from museum trips. Everything was perfect and sterile and expensive in a way that made her feel intensely out of place. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, though the word felt inadequate. "It's empty," Marco corrected, and there was an edge to his voice. "Until now. Until you." He led her to the windows, and they stood together looking out at the glittering city below. Sophie could see her own neighborhood in the distance, the modest buildings, the crowded streets, the life that was all she had ever known. "I need to tell you something," Marco said, his voice serious. He turned her to face him. "I know the media will eventually find out about us. They're relentless, and they'll tear into your life, your family, everything. I want you to be prepared for that." Sophie's stomach tightened. She had been trying not to think about the complications that his wealth and fame brought. "What kind of things will they say?" "That you're a gold digger," Marco said bluntly. "That you're taking advantage of me. That you're not good enough for me. That our relationship is some kind of scandal. They'll dig into your family, your work history, your personal life. It will be invasive and hurtful." Sophie felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. She thought of her mother, who had always worried about what people thought. She thought of her siblings, who were just beginning to build their own lives. "That sounds terrible." "It is," Marco said. "But I don't care what they say about me. I've learned to let that roll off my back. What I care about is protecting you. So I need to know, are you willing to go public with this? Are you willing to face that scrutiny because you want to be with me?" Sophie was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the disparity between them, about the very real ways in which she didn't fit into his world. She thought about her dream of becoming a doctor, the life she had put on hold. But when she looked at Marco, when she saw the vulnerability and fear in his eyes, she knew her answer. "Yes," she said softly. "Because this isn't about your money or your status for me. It's about you. It's about the man who loves his son so fiercely that he's willing to be vulnerable about his limitations as a parent. It's about the man who listened to me talk about my dreams without making me feel small or foolish for not pursuing them. If I'm going to face the world's judgment anyway, I want to face it beside you." Marco pulled her close, kissing her with a tenderness and passion that made her entire body respond. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet with tears. "I love you," he said, the words coming out raw and unguarded. "I know it's fast, and I know it's complicated, but I love you, Sophie. I want you in my life. I want you to be Leonardo's stepmother. I want—" He paused, seeming to struggle with his emotions. "I want to marry you." Sophie's eyes widened. "Marco, we've only known each other for 3 weeks." "I know," he said. "I know it's fast. But I also know that life is short and precious and unpredictable. I lost Isabella without warning. I could lose anything, anyone, at any moment. And I don't want to waste a single day not being fully committed to the people I love. So I'm not asking for an answer tonight. I'm just telling you how I feel. When you're ready, if you ever are, I want to marry you." Sophie didn't say she loved him back that night, though she felt it in every fiber of her being. Instead, she held him close and let herself imagine a future that she had never thought was possible for someone like her. The headlines hit 3 weeks later, exactly as Marco had predicted. Billionaire's new romance. From waitress to penthouse. One tabloid screamed. Cinderella story or gold digger? Another questioned. Within hours, Sophie's life had spiraled into chaos. She had taken a leave of absence from the restaurant, unable to face the paparazzi who had begun camping outside the building where she worked. Her social media accounts were flooded with nasty comments from strangers, everything from "she's only with him for the money" to far more vicious and personal attacks. People she thought were friends began distancing themselves, uncomfortable with the attention. The worst part was what happened to her family. Her mother called her in tears one evening, telling her that neighbors were gossiping, that her younger brother had gotten into a physical fight at college when someone made a cruel comment about Sophie, that her sister was being ostracized by her friend group. The impact of Sophie's relationship with Marco rippled outward, affecting everyone she loved. Sophie was sitting alone in the penthouse one afternoon, trying to work through her feelings, when Marco came home early from work. He found her curled up on the couch, staring out the window at nothing. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, sitting beside her and pulling her into his arms. "My family," Sophie said, her voice breaking. "They're suffering because of me, because I got involved with you. My mother is devastated by the things people are saying. My brother's college is considering disciplinary action for the fight. My sister is struggling in her new school because of rumors." She pulled away from him, looking at his face. "This isn't fair to them." "It's not fair," Marco agreed. "But it will pass. The media cycle moves fast. Someone else will become the subject of their attention, and they'll forget about us." "What if they don't?" Sophie asked. "What if this becomes a permanent part of our lives? I can't do that to my family, Marco. I can't keep asking them to suffer because I wanted to be with you." Marco was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call. Sophie watched as he spoke to someone, his voice calm and authoritative. "I want a statement released." "No, a formal one from me personally. I want to address the media speculation about Sophie and my relationship." He paused, listening. "Yes, I'm sure. And I want it done today." That evening, Marco's statement went viral. In it, he spoke about meeting Sophie, about falling in love with her, about his admiration for her character and her strength. Most importantly, he outlined a plan. He was setting up a scholarship fund in Sophie's name to be given to students from underprivileged backgrounds who wanted to pursue medical careers. And he made it clear that he expected the media to leave Sophie's family alone, or he would use every resource at his disposal to ensure they regretted it. The statement was clever. It reframed the narrative from gold digger to wealthy man supports talented woman's dreams. But there was something missing, something that Sophie sensed immediately. "You didn't mention marriage," she said softly, when Marco came to find her after releasing the statement. "I know," Marco said. "I wanted to. But I realize that this needs to be your decision, Sophie. I don't want you marrying me because you feel pressured or obligated. I want you to marry me because you love me and because you want to build a life with me." Sophie felt tears spring to her eyes. "I do love you. I have for a while now. I was just scared. Scared of what it meant, scared of the consequences, scared that I wasn't good enough for you." "You're more than good enough," Marco said fiercely. "You're extraordinary, and I don't ever want you to forget that." He dropped to one knee then, pulling out a diamond ring that caught the light of the Manhattan skyline. "Sophie Maria Delgado, will you marry me? Not because of the media, not because of the money, but because I love you, and I want to spend my life with you and Leonardo. Will you be my wife?" Sophie said yes through her tears, laughing and crying at the same time as Marco slipped the ring onto her finger. It was massive, a flawless diamond that probably cost more than her family's house. But what mattered was what it represented. It represented his love, his commitment, his belief in them. But that night, as Sophie lay awake beside Marco in bed, she couldn't shake a nagging feeling of unease. Something about the way Marco had behaved, The way he'd immediately handled the situation with his wealth and power reminded her of something she couldn't quite place. There was a smoothness to it, a competence that suggested this wasn't his first time managing a public relations crisis involving a woman. She pushed the thought away, telling herself she was being paranoid and jealous. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it would grow. 2 months into their engagement, Sophie discovered something that would shake her to her core. She had been organizing Marco's office, a space he rarely used because he conducted most of his business from his company's headquarters, when she came across an old leather album tucked away on a high shelf. It was filled with photographs of Marco with different women, all of them beautiful, all of them young. Some of the women appeared in multiple photos, suggesting longer-term relationships. The pictures spanned a decade, from Marco's early 20s to more recent years. But what caught her attention most were the sticky notes attached to certain photos. On one photograph of a blonde woman, there was a note that said, "Relationship duration, 6 months, ended when wealth disparity became problematic." On another, of a stunning redhead, ended when she expected marriage proposal. On yet another, settled generously, no media complications. Sophie's heart had begun to race as she realized what she was looking at. These were case studies. Marco had documented his relationships like they were business ventures to be managed and ultimately liquidated. She heard Marco's footsteps in the hallway and quickly returned the album to its place on the shelf. But the image of those photographs, those clinical notes, had burned themselves into her mind. That evening, Sophie confronted him about it. "Why do you have a photo album documenting your relationships?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Marco's face went pale. "Sophie, I can explain." "Explain what?" "The fact that you keep detailed records of your past relationships like they're business transactions? The fact that you've documented what you consider to be reasons for ending them?" Her voice grew louder, more emotional. "Did you do this with Isabella?" "No," Marco said firmly. "That started after Isabella. After I grieved her, I realized I wasn't good at relationships. I didn't understand what women wanted from me. Was it my money? My status? My body? I couldn't tell the difference anymore. So I started keeping records, trying to understand the pattern, to figure out what went wrong in each relationship." "That's insane," Sophie said. "Those are people, Marco, not experiments." "I know," Marco said, and his voice was anguished. "I know it's wrong, but I was broken after Isabella. I was trying to put myself back together in the only way I knew how, by treating everything like a problem to be solved. I'm not proud of it." Sophie wanted to believe him. She wanted to think this was a sign of his grief and confusion, not a sign of something darker. But the doubt had taken root, and she couldn't completely shake it. "Did you document me?" she asked quietly. "No," Marco said immediately. "I destroyed that album the day I met you. I realized that I didn't want to approach our relationship that way, that I wanted to be present and authentic with you." "I don't believe you," Sophie said, and the words hung between them like a challenge. What happened next surprised them both. Instead of getting defensive, Marco pulled out his laptop and showed her the trash file on his computer, where the digital version of his notes still existed, not yet permanently deleted. He walked through each entry, explaining his thought process, his confusion, his grief. And then he permanently deleted the file in front of her, the digital trace of his documentation of her predecessors vanishing forever. "I'm not perfect," Marco said. "I've made mistakes. But I love you, Sophie. I'm not in love with the idea of you, or with what you represent. I'm in love with you as a person, and I promise you, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that love." Sophie wanted to believe him, and over the following days and weeks, as her anger faded and Marco's sincerity seemed to shine through his actions, she began to. But that small kernel of doubt remained, a reminder that the man she loved was more complicated than she had initially understood. 6 months after their first meeting, Sophie and Marco got married. It was a small ceremony in a garden overlooking the coast of the Hamptons. Just 100 guests. Mostly Marco's business associates, a few of Sophie's family members, and the people closest to both of them. Sophie wore a simple, elegant white dress that didn't scream expensive but absolutely was. Marco wore a classic black tuxedo and looked at her with such adoration that Sophie's lingering doubts seemed to fade away. Leonardo, dressed in a tiny tuxedo, was the ring-bearer, and he toddled down the aisle with the help of Marco's best friend, leaving a trail of giggles in his wake. When it came time to exchange vows, Marco held Sophie's hands and spoke from the heart about how she had changed his life, how she had shown him what it meant to love unconditionally, how she was going to be the most incredible mother to Leonardo. Sophie's vows were simpler, but no less powerful. She promised to stand by him through good times and bad, to help him be the best father Leonardo could have, and to build a life filled with love and laughter. When they kissed to seal their marriage, the entire garden erupted in applause. The first year of their marriage was genuinely happy. Marco worked to give Sophie the space to pursue her own interests, and Sophie threw herself into being a mother to Leonardo. She started taking online courses, working toward her degree in pre-med, and Marco supported her financially and emotionally. They created routines together, family nights where they cooked meals as a unit, weekends in the country where they could be away from the city's chaos, quiet evenings where they simply held each other and talked about their dreams. Leonardo thrived with Sophie in his life. The little boy was happier, more confident, and he had bonded with Sophie in a way that suggested a deep, instinctive connection between them. Marco watched his son flourish and felt gratitude wash over him every single day. But then, approximately 14 months after their wedding, everything changed. Sophie woke up feeling nauseous. She thought it was something she'd eaten, but the nausea persisted for days. Then she realized she was late. 2 weeks late. Her hands were shaking as she purchased a pregnancy test at the pharmacy, and she was shaking even harder when she saw the 2 pink lines. She was pregnant with Marco's child. The emotions that washed over her were complicated. She and Marco had never explicitly discussed children of their own. She knew he had Leonardo, and she had assumed, perhaps naively, that the billionaire was satisfied with 1 child. But now, as she stared at the positive pregnancy test, she realized that she wanted this baby. She wanted to carry Marco's child, to give Leonardo a biological sibling, to expand their family. Marco's reaction, however, was not what she had expected. When she told him that evening, he went very still. His face went blank in a way that terrified her more than anger would have. "Did you do this intentionally?" he asked quietly. "No," Sophie said, shocked by the question. "It was an accident. We've been careful." "But you're happy about it," Marco said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Sophie said. "Aren't you?" Marco stood up and walked away from her, moving to the window. He stood there for a long time, his back to her, his shoulders tense. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled but cold. "I need to be honest with you about something. Something I should have told you before we married, but I was too much of a coward to do it." Sophie felt her stomach drop. "What?" "I can't have biological children," Marco said. "At least not anymore. When Isabella and I were first trying to have a baby, we discovered that I have a condition, a genetic issue that has a 60% chance of being passed on to any biological children I father. The condition is degenerative and eventually fatal. My parents both died from it. They both died before they turned 60. Sophie's hands flew to her mouth. "Leonardo was a miracle baby," Marco continued. "When Isabella got pregnant, the doctors told us that because of the genetic risk, we should terminate the pregnancy. We didn't. We decided to take the chance. Leonardo was tested as a newborn. He doesn't have the condition. The 60% chance passed him by. He finally turned to face her, and his eyes were haunted. But there's still a 60% chance that our child will have it. I couldn't do that to Isabella. put her through the emotional torture of carrying a baby that might be born with a death sentence. And after Leonardo, I had a vasectomy. I made sure I couldn't have any more biological children. Sophie felt the room spin around her. Wait, you had a vasectomy? Yes, Marco said. Years ago, after Leonardo was born. Then how am I pregnant? Sophie whispered. That's what I'm wondering, Marco said, and there was an undercurrent of something dangerous in his voice. Vasectomies can occasionally fail, but it's rare. 1%. Less than 1%. He paused. Or you were already pregnant when we married, and you lied to me about the paternity. I would never... Sophie started, but Marco held up a hand. I don't know what to believe, he said coldly. I don't know you well enough to know if you're capable of lying at this level. And that's the worst part. That's what terrifies me most. Not the possibility of a child with a genetic condition, but the fact that I married someone and I don't even know them. Sophie felt tears streaming down her face. Marco, I'm telling you the truth. I didn't know about your condition, and I didn't intentionally get pregnant, but we're married now. We're in this together. Are we? Marco asked, and there was such coldness in his voice that Sophie felt her heart break a little. Because right now, I feel like I've made a terrible mistake. He left the penthouse that night without telling her where he was going or when he'd be back. Sophie spent the next 3 days in a state of shock and despair. She called Marco multiple times, but he didn't answer. She texted him, sent him emails, tried to explain her perspective on the situation, but he remained silent and unreachable. She felt completely alone, pregnant, and terrified, in a penthouse that suddenly felt like a cage rather than a home. On the 4th day, Marco's lawyer showed up at the apartment with a stack of documents. Sophie's heart had already begun to crumble, and the sight of those legal papers made it disintegrate entirely. Mr. Castellano has asked me to present you with these separation papers, the lawyer said, his tone professional and distant. He's willing to be generous with the settlement. $5 million, an apartment in a building of your choosing, child support payments, and ongoing medical care for you and the baby. In exchange, he requires that you agree not to discuss this separation or the reasons for it with the media, and that you agree to a custody arrangement whereby he has primary custody of Leonardo. Sophie couldn't speak. She couldn't even cry. She felt like she was watching this happen to someone else, like she was outside her own body looking down at this nightmare. There are also, the lawyer continued, some questions regarding the paternity of your current child. Mr. Castellano has requested that you undergo prenatal DNA testing as soon as possible to establish paternity beyond a shadow of a doubt. The words felt like a slap across the face. He thinks I lied about the baby being his? Mr. Castellano is taking precautions, the lawyer said carefully. I'm sure you understand. Sophie didn't understand. She felt betrayed and hurt and furious. Here was the man she loved, the man she had married, and he was treating her like a criminal, like a gold digger who had somehow tricked him into this situation. I won't sign, Sophie said, her voice shaking with rage. Tell him I won't sign anything, and tell him he can't take Leonardo from me. I'm his mother now. Biologically, you're not his mother, the lawyer said carefully. And Mr. Castellano is his biological father and legal guardian. If you refuse to cooperate with these arrangements, Mr. Castellano has indicated that he will pursue full custody and seek to have you removed from the child's life entirely. Sophie felt like the world was collapsing. That's not fair. Leonardo and I, we have a bond. He loves me. I'm sure he does, the lawyer said, and for the first time, Sophie detected a note of sympathy in his tone. But legally, Mr. Castellano has all the power here. He's the biological parent, you're not. The prenuptial agreement you signed before your marriage. Prenuptial agreement? Sophie interrupted. I didn't sign a prenuptial agreement. The lawyer looked confused. "Your signature is right here," he said, flipping through the documents. "You signed it the night before your wedding." Sophie stared at the signature. It was hers. She had signed something the night before her wedding, while Marco was being romantic and saying he didn't need a prenup because he trusted her completely. She had signed it without reading it carefully, too caught up in the romance and excitement of the moment. "I want to speak to Marco," Sophie said. "In person, right now." "I'm afraid that's not possible," the lawyer said. "Mr. Castellano has instructed me to handle all communication. He's asked that you have no contact with him or Leonardo for the time being." Sophie felt something break inside her, not her heart, which was already shattered, but something deeper. She realized then that the man she had married, the man she had loved with everything she had carefully orchestrated this entire scenario. From the moment he saw her in that restaurant, comforting his son, he had identified her as someone vulnerable, someone without resources or support system, someone he could manipulate and ultimately discard. The album of his exes, which he claimed to have destroyed, suddenly made sense. Those weren't just documentation of failed relationships. They were part of a pattern, a predatory pattern. "Get out," Sophie said to the lawyer, her voice quiet but deadly. "Get out of my apartment now, or I'll call the police." The lawyer gathered his documents and left, leaving Sophie alone with her rage and her despair and the life growing inside her. Sophie didn't sign the separation papers. Instead, she hired a lawyer of her own, a woman named Patricia Chen, who specialized in family law and who took on Sophie's case pro bono because something about the situation troubled her deeply. "This doesn't add up," Patricia said, reviewing all the documentation. According to his own testimony, Marco had a vasectomy years ago, but he's claiming that's impossible, that there's a 1% failure rate, and that you must have lied about the paternity. He also claims he destroyed all records of his past relationships, Sophie said bitterly. "But I found them. I found the documentation of how he systematically dates vulnerable women, convinces them to marry him, and then finds a reason to discard them. I found evidence that at least 3 of his ex-girlfriends have claimed in private lawsuits that he engaged in emotional manipulation and coercive control." Patricia's expression hardened. This is a pattern, and if it's a pattern, then we need to understand what he's planning here. Why now? What triggered his sudden change in behavior? Sophie had been asking herself the same question over and over. She had gone back through their conversations, looking for some sign that she had missed, some indication that this was all part of his plan. And then she realized something. "My medical history," she said slowly. "When Marco first asked about my life, I told him about my father's stroke, about how I'd left medical school to help my family. He knew about my dream to become a doctor, and when I got pregnant, he reacted as if it was a betrayal." Patricia listened intently as Sophie explained the chronology of events, and then Patricia said something that made Sophie's blood run cold. "Is it possible that Marco never intended for you to stay in his life long term? Is it possible that he planned to use your pregnancy, whether real or fabricated, as the reason for the separation all along?" Sophie felt sick, because yes, it was entirely possible. It was even likely. What happened next was a series of revelations that came pouring out once Patricia started investigating. She discovered that Marco had a history of relationships that followed an identical pattern. 1. He would meet a vulnerable woman. 2. He would court her intensely, making her feel special and valued. 3. He would marry her quickly. 4. He would identify some aspect of her that he could weaponize: ambition, family obligations, financial vulnerability. He would manufacture a crisis around that aspect. 6. He would use that crisis as justification to discover that she had lied to him or betrayed him. 7. He would end the relationship, often while invoking legal mechanisms to ensure the woman in question had minimal recourse. In one particularly chilling case, Patricia discovered that Marco had convinced his ex-girlfriend, a woman named Elena, who had been a medical resident when they met, that he would help fund her medical school education. He had married her then, 6 months later, had begun restricting her access to financial information and her own accounts. When she tried to leave, he threatened to expose some compromising photos of her that he claimed to have in his possession. But in the case of Sophie, Marco had made a critical error. He had chosen a woman who was not just vulnerable, but also honest. A woman who loved him not for his money, but for the man she thought he was. A woman who would fight. "The prenuptial you signed," Patricia explained, "is ironclad. But I've found some interesting language in it that I think can be challenged." Over the next few weeks, Patricia filed a lawsuit challenging the validity of the prenuptial agreement on grounds of duress and lack of full disclosure. She also filed a separate custody case, arguing that Sophie had developed a maternal relationship with Leonardo and that an abrupt removal would be psychologically damaging to the child. Marco's response was immediate and aggressive. He launched a countersuit, claiming that Sophie had lied about her medical history, that she had intentionally gotten pregnant to trap him into keeping her in his life, and that she was an unfit mother figure for Leonardo based on her unstable emotional state. But Patricia was ready. She had uncovered the pattern. She had documented it meticulously. And when Marco's case went to trial, the judge was presented with evidence of a pattern of predatory behavior that went beyond just Sophie. There were affidavits from his ex-girlfriends, documentation of his systematic emotional manipulation, proof that he had engaged in coercive control. The judge was not sympathetic. "This court finds," the judge stated, "that the prenuptial agreement signed by Ms. Delgado was executed under conditions of duress and insufficient disclosure. Furthermore, this court finds substantial evidence of emotional manipulation and coercive control on the part of Mr. Castellano. Therefore, the prenuptial agreement is declared null and void." The courtroom was silent as Marco's face went white. Sophie felt tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of vindication, of survival, of hope. What happened to Marco after the trial was both karma and tragedy intertwined. Without the prenuptial agreement to protect him, Marco's settlement with Sophie was far more substantial than he'd anticipated. He had to pay her $20 million, not as a lump sum, but as ongoing support payments. He also lost the custody battle over Leonardo. While Marco was granted visitation rights and equal decision-making authority over major life decisions, Sophie was declared Leonardo's primary caregiver. But the financial damage, while significant, was nothing compared to the reputational damage. The story exploded across the media. Every news outlet picked it up. Billionaire's pattern of predatory relationships exposed. Tech titan used marriage as tool of manipulation. The documentation of his behavior with his ex-girlfriends became public record. Several of the women he had been in relationships with came forward with their own stories, each more damaging than the last. One woman revealed that Marco had threatened to release naked photos of her if she tried to leave him. Another stated that he had isolated her from her family and friends, making her entirely dependent on him. A third claimed that he had convinced her she was mentally unstable and needed him to manage her finances. Marco tried to respond through his lawyers and through statements issued by his PR team, but nothing stuck. The narrative had been established, and the public was hungry for accountability. His business empire began to crumble. Investors lost confidence. Board members demanded his resignation. Several of his business partners dissolved their relationships with him. Within 6 months, Marco had gone from being a respected tech billionaire to being a pariah. But Sophie found no joy in his fall from grace. Instead, she was focused on building a life for herself and her child. She finished her pre-med degree, and then, with Marco's reluctant support, court-ordered, she enrolled in medical school. She was 30 years old when she started, older than most of her classmates, but also more mature, more driven, more aware of why she was doing it. Leonardo remained confused about why his father was no longer living with them, but Sophie made sure that he maintained a relationship with Marco. She didn't badmouth Marco to the boy or use him as a weapon. She simply told Leonardo that sometimes people love each other, but aren't able to live together. And that didn't mean Marco didn't love him. She took Leonardo to his visitations, and she picked him up afterward, and she never made it awkward. Sophie's daughter was born 14 months after the trial concluded. She was a beautiful baby with dark eyes like her father, and Sophie named her Isabella, in honor of Marco's first wife. She wanted her daughter to know that she was born out of love, even if her father was a deeply flawed and troubled man. Marco paid his child support faithfully. Sophie had to give him that. He was financially responsible, even if he was emotionally absent and manipulative. But life had other plans for Marcus Castellano. That punishment was not enough to teach him. 3 years after the trial, Marco was diagnosed with the genetic condition he had feared so much, the degenerative neurological condition that had killed both of his parents. The diagnosis came as a complete shock. Marco had been confident, based on his research and the medical advice he'd sought out, that because he had taken precautions, the vasectomy, and had not passed the condition to Leonardo, as proven by genetic testing, he himself must not have developed the condition. But he was wrong. He had the condition, and according to his doctors, it was already progressing more rapidly than it had in his parents. He had perhaps 5 to 7 years before the condition would begin to seriously impact his quality of life. He had perhaps 10 years before he would face the same fate as his parents, a slow, degenerative decline that would eventually claim his life. Sophie learned about Marco's diagnosis through Leonardo, who heard about it from his father. The 6-year-old boy was scared and confused, and he came to Sophie looking for reassurance. "Is Daddy going to die?" Leonardo asked, his small voice breaking. Sophie held him close, and she had to make a choice in that moment. She could have been bitter. She could have used this as an opportunity to push Marco out of Leonardo's life, to punish him for his past behavior, to make him understand the pain he had caused her. Instead, she made a decision that surprised even herself. She called Marco. "I know about the diagnosis," she said without preamble. "Leonardo's scared." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Marco said, "Sophie, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything. I've been seeing a therapist for the past 3 years, and I've come to understand how deeply I hurt you. I've come to understand the pattern of my behavior, and I'm trying to change. But I understand if you don't believe me. I understand if you want nothing to do with me." "Leonardo needs his father," Sophie said simply. "And whether I believe you or not, he loves you. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to be there for him. You're going to spend as much time as possible with him. And when the time comes, when the condition starts to impact you, you're going to let me help you. Not because I forgive you for what you did, but because I'm not the same person I was when you met me. I'm not someone who needs to punish people to feel powerful. I'm a doctor now, Marco, and as a doctor, I can see a patient who needs help." "Why would you do that?" Marco asked, and his voice was shaking with emotion. "After everything I did to you?" "Because," Sophie said, "I learned from someone very important to me that you show love not by expecting people to be perfect, but by showing up for them anyway, by holding space for their humanity, even when they've failed." 3 years later, as Marco's condition progressed and he began to need increasing amounts of care, Sophie was true to her word. She coordinated his medical care, she advocated for him with the healthcare system, and when he finally moved into a care facility, she visited him regularly. Sometimes she brought Leonardo. Sometimes she brought Isabella. And in those final visits, as Marco's mind began to deteriorate along with his body, he looked at Sophie with a clarity that she hadn't seen in years, and he said the words that mattered most. "Thank you for teaching me what love really means." 6 years after Marco's diagnosis, Sophie was a successful doctor working in pediatrics at a major New York hospital. She had achieved her dream, the dream that Marco had once tried to take from her and that she had reclaimed for herself. Leonardo was now a brilliant 12-year-old boy who had inherited his father's intelligence and his mother's, both of them, Isabella the first and Sophie the second, compassion. He spent his free time volunteering at the hospital where Sophie worked, shadowing her, asking questions, fascinated by medicine. It seemed likely that he would follow in his mother's footsteps. Isabella, Sophie's biological daughter with Marco, was 8 years old. She was bright and creative, and she had a special bond with her half-brother that warmed Sophie's heart. The two children loved each other fiercely, and Sophie had made sure that Isabella knew her father, not through bitterness or judgment, but through compassion and honesty. Sophie was also in a new relationship. His name was David, and he was a hospital administrator she'd met at work. He was kind and supportive, and he loved both of her children. He was not wealthy. He earned a comfortable middle-class income. But that was exactly what Sophie wanted. She had learned that love had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with showing up day after day, with kindness and respect. On a rare day off, Sophie found herself at the care facility where Marco now spent his days. His condition had progressed significantly. He was nonverbal now, unable to communicate except through his eyes and occasional hand squeezes. But Sophie knew that there was still someone in there, still the man who had loved her, still the father who had wanted the best for his son. She sat beside his bed and held his hand. "I wanted to tell you something," she said softly. "Leonardo got accepted to the summer program at Columbia. It's a program for young people interested in medicine. He's going to shadow doctors at the hospital. He's going to help change people's lives, Marco. Your legacy isn't the money or the company. It's Leonardo. It's the beautiful human being you created." Marco's eyes, still sharp despite the deterioration of his body, filled with tears. His hand squeezed Sophie's, a gentle pressure that carried more weight than any words could have. "And Isabella," Sophie continued, "she drew a picture of you yesterday. She doesn't really remember you, not clearly, but she knows you're her father. She knows you loved her, and she knows that her mom loves her, and that's what matters." Sophie stayed for another hour, simply sitting with Marco, sharing silence and presence. When she left, she kissed him on the forehead, not with romantic love, but with the kind of love that comes from survival, from compassion, from the choice to see someone's humanity even after they've deeply hurt you. Marco died 6 weeks later, in his sleep, with the care staff surrounding him. He was only 41 years old. At his funeral, which Sophie attended with both of her children, she found herself grieving, not for the predatory man who had tried to manipulate her, but for the troubled soul who had been broken by his genetics and his upbringing, who had hurt people because he didn't know how to love, who had ultimately found redemption through his children and through the woman he had wronged, but who had chosen mercy over revenge. Leonardo gave a eulogy that made everyone in the church cry. He spoke about the father he had known, flawed and complicated, but loving in his own way. He spoke about learning from his father's mistakes, about the importance of being honest with yourself and with the people you love. He spoke about how his father had taught him, through his failures, what kind of man Leonardo wanted to become. After the funeral, as they were leaving the church, David put his arm around Sophie and whispered, "You're the strongest person I know." Sophie shook her head. "I'm not strong. I just chose to keep moving forward. I chose to build something good from the ashes of what he tried to destroy. That's not strength. That's survival." 10 years after that fateful night in Ristorante Bella Vista, Sophie found herself back at the restaurant for the first time since she'd left to pursue her medical degree. She had come with Leonardo, who was now 23 years old and in his final year of medical school. The restaurant had been remodeled, updated, but the core of it remained the same: warm lighting, excellent food, a sense of intimacy and care. The owner, a woman named Maria who had taken over the restaurant after the previous owner retired, recognized Sophie immediately. "Dr. Delgado, I've been following your career. You've done so much for our community. The clinic you opened in Astoria has helped thousands of people. I'm so proud of you." Sophie hugged Maria warmly. "I never would have had the courage to pursue medicine if my journey hadn't led me through here. If it hadn't been for one moment of compassion, one act of kindness that a waitress offered to a stranger, I wouldn't be here today." "You're talking about that night," Maria said, smiling. "When you nursed that little boy. That became legend around here. Every new server we hire, we tell them that story about how one act of compassion can change everything. Leonardo looked confused. Wait, that's the story about you and Marco? Yes, Sophie said, leading her son to their table. That's how we met. That's where this whole journey began. Over dinner, Sophie told Leonardo the full story, not just the facts that he'd lived through, but the emotional journey, the confusion and pain and ultimate redemption. She told him about that first moment when Marco had asked her to comfort his son, about the dinner afterward when she'd started to fall in love with him, about the subsequent betrayals and the legal battles. But Mom, Leonardo said thoughtfully, you forgave him, even after everything he did to you, even after you won the lawsuit. You still chose to be kind to him. I did, Sophie agreed. Not because what he did was okay. It wasn't. But because I learned that holding on to anger was like swallowing poison and expecting the other person to die. Forgiveness wasn't for him. It was for me. It freed me to move forward. Leonardo was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's why I want to be a pediatrician. I want to help kids who've been hurt, who've been damaged. I want to use what I learned from my parents, the good and the bad, to make other people's lives better." Sophie felt proud tears in her eyes. Her son was becoming the man she'd always known he could be, a healer, a compassionate human being, a person who would make the world better just by existing in it. After dinner, they took a walk through the city, through the neighborhoods where Sophie had grown up, past the hospital where she now worked, past the clinic she had founded. They walked past the building that housed Marco's old offices, which had been converted into condominiums. And finally, they stood at the observation deck of the Empire State Building, looking out over the sprawling city that had been the setting for Sophie's life-changing journey. "Do you ever regret it?" Leonardo asked. "Meeting Dad? Getting involved with all of it?" Sophie thought about this carefully. Did she regret meeting Marco? Did she regret the pain and betrayal, the legal battles, the media scrutiny? "No," she said finally. "Not at all. Because everything that happened, the good and the bad, led me to where I am now. I'm a doctor. I'm helping people every single day. I have you and your sister, and I have David, who loves me for exactly who I am. I have a life filled with meaning and purpose. Your father, for all his flaws, was the catalyst for all of that. And I've learned that sometimes the people who hurt us most profoundly are also the people who teach us the most valuable lessons." She put her arm around Leonardo. "Your father was a broken man who tried to control the world around him because his internal world felt so chaotic and out of control. But he loved you, Leonardo. He loved you so much that he wanted to protect you, even if his methods were misguided. And at the end, I think he understood that love isn't about control. It's about letting go." Leonardo leaned his head on his mother's shoulder, and together they looked out over the glittering expanse of Manhattan, a city of millions of people, each with their own stories, their own struggles, their own journeys toward redemption and love. Somewhere in that city was Isabella, now 18 years old, preparing for her freshman year of college. Somewhere in that city were the men and women that Sophie had healed, the patients she had cared for in the emergency room, the children she had comforted when they were scared and in pain. Somewhere in that city was David, Sophie's new husband, working late at the hospital, supporting the work that Sophie did. And somewhere, in a small cemetery in Queens, Marco Castellano rested, finally at peace, the complications of his life resolved by the simple fact of mortality. Sophie had come full circle, from a vulnerable young woman in a restaurant, comforting a stranger's child, to a doctor who had learned that the most powerful healing came not from conquering others, but from forgiving them, from holding space for their humanity even when they had failed. The city lights twinkled below her, thousands of windows illuminated by the lives of thousands of people. And Sophie felt, for the first time since that night in Ristorante Bella Vista, completely at peace. She had survived. She had grown. She had loved and been hurt, and had chosen to keep loving anyway. And in the end, that choice, to love fiercely, to forgive generously, to build a life of meaning and purpose, was the most powerful triumph of all.